is the first in an event series made possible by the Community Foundation of the Virgin Islands Humanities Grants, which are funded by the National Endowment of the Humanities. We have 3 events in this series, and this seminar discussion series will explore how scholars, artists, community organizers, and members of our community grapple with questions related to conservation, sustainable development, disaster capitalism, and environmental racism. And also, it's quite attentive to our relationship to the Virgin Islands National Park. The first event in this series will be followed by 2 events, one in July 2021, titled Virgin Islands Creole, exploring the relationship between language, culture, and freedom in the US Virgin Islands. And then that will be followed in November by a 3rd event titled Small Islands in the Anthropocene, Environmental Justice and the Arts in the US Virgin Islands. Both the July and the November events are meant to also commemorate significant and pivotal moments in the history of the United States Virgin Islands, formerly known as the Danish West Indies, in particular our Emancipation Day and the Hamilton-Jackson Day. So please look out for these events by following St. JanCo on social media. And so I am your facilitator for today's teach-in. I am Dr. Hadia Soar, the president and co-founder of St. JanCo. I'm also a St. Jonian, a mother, and a research fellow in the African and African American Studies program at Stanford University. I earned my PhD in Africana Studies at Brown University, where I studied questions related to race, colonialism, Caribbean philosophy, and environmental justice. Today, I'm very excited to be joined by my fellow panelists. We have Dr. Crystal Fort-Wrangler, visiting professor and film program director at La Roche University. We have attorney David DiGiacomo, vice president of Island Green Living Association. We have our Virgin Islands National Park Superintendent, Mr. Nigel Fields. And we are also joined by Mr. Cletus Clendenin, District Director of the Office of the Congresswoman, Stacey Plaskett.
Morning.
Good morning. So today's teach-in aims to examine the challenges surrounding the closure of the Caneel Bay Resort. Ultimately, we hope to provide education and continue to foster community engagement. Today, we hope to tackle several key questions. Most notably, why is the Caneel Bay Resort currently closed? What are the larger social and historical forces that brought us to today's challenges at Caneel? And how can we as members of the community get involved, voice our concerns about the issues at Caneel Bay, and also generally feel empowered to help determine Caneel Bay's future? Most importantly, we want to reimagine the future of Caneel Bay and collectively work to design a trajectory that will benefit the community as a whole. So this event will be followed by a community workshop where members of the VI community can create art and also participate in a letter writing campaign around the Caneel Bay issue so that we can effectively direct some of our concerns to those who are in direct position to affect change and to make decisions as it relates to Caneel. And so please continue to be on the lookout for this campaign so that we can all share space together and collaborate around advocacy. Now, we truly appreciate your willingness to join us on this beautiful day. And we also appreciate your willingness to speak out, but also to learn a bit more about some of the critical issues that are facing our community and Caneel Bay in particular. On Thursday, April 8th, 2021, the Virgin Islands National Park held a listening session on Caneel. And it was a pleasure to have the opportunity to participate in this listening session, where members of our community were able to voice some of our concerns. Attendees were asked to respond to 4 super important questions regarding our personal and professional connections to Caneel Bay, our thoughts on preserving the history and culture of Caneel Bay and St. John as a whole, as well as to speak a bit about the previous and existing challenges at Caneel, with an eye towards providing suggestions for improving operations at Caneel in the 21st century. I'd like to note that there will be other opportunities to learn about the challenges surrounding Caneel and to continue to voice your concerns. And so if you missed this event, which was hosted by the National Park Service, or if you attended and found that you have additional responses that you'd like to share, we'd like to encourage you to submit written feedback online. And to do so, you can go to go.nps.gov/Caneel Bay. And so as it relates to the critical issues surrounding Caneel, there are some important dates that we would like for you to keep in mind. During the listening session that was held on April 8th, we were reminded that on May 13th, the Virgin Islands National Park will host a virtual open house. On June 10th, the National Park Service will have a public meeting on Caneel Bay Engineering Evaluation Cost Analysis, the EECA, for environmental cleanup. And on July 25th, the public comment period will close on the EECA. And so the key stakeholders in this issue are really working to ensure that there are multiple opportunities for hearing and addressing the community's concerns. And so in today's teach-in, we hope that we can provide information for viewers with differing perspectives and differing levels of understanding of the issue. So whether you are avidly paying attention to the news on Caneel, or if you have no idea what's going on with Caneel Bay, we hope that you can learn something that you'll find useful as you continue to develop your own opinions and engage in advocacy around the issue. And so to give you a sense of our timeline today, I'll get this teach-in started by providing an introduction to the Caneel Bay issue. And then I'll be followed by Attorney David DiGiacomo, who will give an overview of the environmental challenges at Caneel. Attorney DiGiacomo will be followed by Mr. Cletus Clendenin of the Delegate's Office, who will offer a greater understanding of the federal government's role in helping to address the Caneel Bay closure, and specifically the actions of the Office of the Delegate. Our Superintendent, Nigel Fields, will provide an overview of the park's role in the Caneel Bay issue. And our presentations will conclude with a discussion by Dr. Crystal Fort-Wrangler that will talk a bit about some of the academic context surrounding the Caneel Bay problem, so to speak, and essentially to really grapple with Caneel Bay as an unfortunate illustration of environmental colonialism and disaster capitalism. And so once we conclude our remarks, we will open up for questions, and you can submit questions to us via Facebook comments. And so we very much look forward to hearing from you. And we are excited to continue to work together to address this very critical issue that's facing our community at this time. And so to give you an overview of the challenges surrounding Caneel Bay, I thought it might be important to talk a bit about the past, so to speak, so that we can get a clear sense of where we are, why it matters, and what we need to consider as we work towards reimagining our future. So as many of us know, the Caneel Bay Resort is an eco-luxury resort located on national park lands on the north shore of St. John, U.S. Virgin Islands. And so the United States, of course, bought the U.S. Virgin Islands for $25 million in gold in the early 20th century. And after the 1917 transfer of the then Danish West Indies to the now US Virgin Islands, there were many questions about the dilapidated infrastructure and unhealthy economy. In the early colonial period, the US Virgin Islands was placed under the mandate rule of the United States Navy for the initial years of American occupation, 1917 to 1934. And so the Naval Administration did not necessarily have the skill set needed to effectively manage a civilian government. And so during the bulk of the period of naval rule in the US Virgin Islands, the Virgin Islanders did not necessarily immediately receive American citizenship, and economic conditions in the territory continued to deteriorate. And so when President Herbert Hoover visited the territory, he stated, quote, "We acquired an effective poorhouse comprising 90% of the population," end quote. And so several steps were subsequently taken to improve the socioeconomic and political condition of the US Virgin Islands and its inhabitants. So the naval period of Virgin Islands history ended in the 1930s and a civilian government was established. Congress was to appoint the governor of the civilian territory, and Virgin Islanders were then offered American citizenship, and tourism, social welfare programs, and private industries were cited as potential boosts to the Virgin Islands economy. So this push for economic self-sufficiency led to the advent of tourism and the establishment of the Virgin Islands National Park. Currently, over 2/3 of the island is occupied by the Virgin Islands National Park and consequently serves as an undeveloped haven for nature tourism, but also for conservation and for access to green space. The establishment of the Virgin Islands National Park in 1956 played a pivotal role in shaping the landscape and by extension, the colonial imaginary on St. John. Lawrence Rockefeller donated thousands of acres for the establishment of the Virgin Islands National Park. The establishment of the Virgin Islands National Park and the growth of the US Virgin Islands tourism industry radically transformed the landscape of St. John into a park, but also a coveted tropical destination. So the earliest days of use at Caneel Bay are linked to, of course, the indigenous people of the Virgin Islands. And this early period was followed by the establishment of the Caneel Bay Plantation. And so starting around the 1930s, Caneel became a winter resort that was quite interested in attracting tourists. In 1935, the West Indian Co. purchased Caneel Bay for $10,000 from a St. Thomas legislator, merchant, and philanthropist to develop a quote-unquote winter resort. The West Indian Co. then sold the property to the Virgin Islands Tourist Company to further promote the Virgin Islands as a tourist center. The resort soon had several cottages, a commissary, fishing, horseback riding, and other activities. So this is the Caneel Bay that was later purchased by Lawrence Rockefeller and is now within the park. In the 1950s, Rockefeller had been inspecting islands throughout the Caribbean in search of the quote-unquote right place to develop a hotel so that others could share his quote-unquote sublime experience of the Caribbean. As many people may be aware, Rockefeller acquired and then donated land to the Park Service to become a part of the Virgin Islands National Park. And while there are certainly benefits to having the national park on St. John, those benefits do not negate the at times problematic issues of land acquisition by Rockefeller's agents, let alone some of the tensions that exist between the park and the wider community over the decades that the park has operated and existed in St. John. The process has often left ancestral St. Johnians and Virgin Islanders in the margins, often feeling as though our voices are not quite heard. Caneel Bay has for some time operated as a luxury space focused on experiences for wealthy tourists and ensuring people are able to experience the Caribbean in a way that Rockefeller wanted them to. But the future of Caneel Bay does not necessarily have to continue in a similar vein. It's possible to integrate an environmental justice approach, which we will discuss later, one that gives us a path forward and also situates Caneel Bay in a much broader cultural and social experience of St. John's past, present, and future. So if we were to fast forward to today, the Caneel Bay Resort remains closed in the aftermath of Hurricanes Irma and Maria, which hit the territory in September of 2017. These two catastrophic Category 5 storms indicate and exemplify Virgin Islanders' precarity on the front lines of the climate crisis. Given the ways that climate change drives the frequency and intensity of such storms amid a warming climate, Hurricanes Irma and Maria's devastation in the St. John, the US Virgin Islands, and several Caribbean islands along the storm's paths also pushes us to think about the long-term impacts of climate change on our socioeconomic, but also cultural well-being and viability as a community. The Caneel Bay Resort sustained extensive damage in the 2017 hurricane season. Instead of reopening, the owner, CBI Acquisitions, LLC, a Connecticut-based company, sought to negotiate an extension of a 40-year retained use estate that was created in 1983 when the 150-acre property was donated to the National Park Service from the Rockefeller family's Jackson Hole Preserve. The RU, as it is called, is due to expire in September of 2023. Negotiations between the National Park Service, the Department of the Interior, and CBI Acquisitions and its affiliates fuel fervent disputes over Caneel's fate. On one hand, the Caneel issue exacerbates underlying tensions between the people of St. John and the Virgin Islands National Park system. St. Johnians have long struggled with the Virgin Islands National Park over a host of issues, including but not limited to, one, some of the more contentious acquisition processes of park lands. Two, contemporary but also historic land access to properties that are landlocked within the park system. Three, what many people understand to be the impact of the Virgin Islands National Park's presence on some of the more sustainable and traditional practices of St. John's people, such as hunting and or foraging and or practicing various arts and crafts. But also, some of these tensions surround what people understand to be the way in which the history of St. John is told through the National Park and its various exhibits. And one of the primary critiques being the question or the extent to which Black and Indigenous Virgin Islanders narratives are historically situated in park properties. And so the fourth tension is essentially around what many understand to be the absence of Virgin Islanders and St. Johnians in particular in key leadership roles within the Virgin Islands National Park. On the other hand, Caneel also raises a set of questions about who should profit from the environmental, cultural, and human resources at the Caneel Bay property. Archaeological research indicates that Caneel Bay has valuable pre-colonial and colonial artifacts. The remnants of the plantation system, the sugar mill, the great house, are very much a part of the resort landscape. Therefore, given some of the historical significant events that took place at Caneel, one example being that Caneel is also the site of a major battle between Europeans and the formerly enslaved Africans who were revolting against slavery during the pivotal 1733 uprising, we often find that the tourism model that currently exists on the Caneel Bay Resort raises questions for many Virgin Islanders about whether or not the current owner or any subsequent owner may be best poised to actually be stewards of the resources that exist on the Caneel Bay property. Historically, and especially for those who have had the opportunity to attend previous community town halls on Caneel Bay, we also find that there are many issues around workers' rights, but also environmental contamination that are continuously raised when the people of St. John have an opportunity to speak up about their feelings regarding the current operations of the Caneel Bay Resort. So we hope that through our conversation today, we can continue to learn a bit more about Caneel Bay as it currently stands, and in so doing, that we may be better prepared to advocate for a future that, as Pam Richards actually said in the listening session on the 8th, gives us opportunities for transformation. And so with that, I will actually pass the mic to Attorney David DiGiacomo so that he can tell us a bit more about the environmental challenges at Caneel.
All right. Can you hear me? Are you ready?
I can hear you.
Thank you, Dr. Hadiya Sewer, for creating this unique opportunity to share this information with the residents of St. John and the Virgin Islands. I've watched as you put this together, and I know it's been a tremendous amount of work, and we all should give you a big applause and round of thanks for this. Of course, you've already thanked a few other groups or people, but I wanted to be sure that I too thank St. JanCo, WTJX, Friends of the Virgin Islands National Park, and Tonya Lovejoy, their executive director, and the Community Foundation of the Virgin Islands. Now, I want you to know that the Caneel contamination is not my only issue, and I look forward to the sharing of the other cultural issues by our other panelists. Now, you've heard a little bit of this background, but I want to go over a couple of things with you. The Caneel Bay Resort on the north shore of St. John consists of approximately 150 acres. It's owned by the people of the United States, and that includes us, the people of the Virgin Islands. There are approximately 100 buildings and structures on the Caneel property, and within the property, as you heard Dr. Sewer explain, there are culturally significant ruins and archaeological sites that go back perhaps thousands of years. But there's also one other really important thing on that site, and that is contamination of the water and of the land by toxic and dangerous chemicals. Now, since Lawrence Rockefeller built the resort in 1956, the operators, including the current operator CBI Acquisitions, have used such things as petroleum products and vehicles, generators, chemicals for cleaning, pesticides, including DDT. They created wastewater treatment sludges, and they used a very significant area of Caneel as a landfill and a dump site near Honeymoon Bay. I can't find that that landfill was ever authorized under any territory or federal laws. And as most of you all know, you can't start dumping waste wherever you want. Landfills are regulated by the EPA. In fact, I have a study from 1977 done by the Park Service where they looked at possible landfill sites in the park. And the Caneel landfill was not even on that. So apparently, they've been using it under the radar for all these years. Now, on September 22nd, 2020, I served a legal notice on the Park Service, the Interior Department, the EPA, and Mr. Gary Engel of CBI Acquisitions, the current operator of Caneel. And it was my intention to sue them based on the significant amount of contamination that I had discovered existed at Caneel. Now, the laws allowing my notice intent to sue are the Clean Water Act, which many of you have heard of, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, also called RCRA, and the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, called CERCLA, sometimes also called the Superfund Law. Each of those laws allows a private citizen to give notice and sue if contaminated sites exist and if the parties responsible for the contamination are not in the business of cleaning it up. You may be asking, how do you know there was contamination at Caneel since the access to the Caneel property had been limited and controlled by CBI acquisitions for years? Well, the answer is there were 3 environmental assessments and reports that were prepared by engineers and scientists for the National Park Service. The environmental assessments were initially done because Mr. Ingalls' company was wanting the Park Service to give him another 40 to 60 years for running a resort, and the Park Service had to inventory what was on the Caneel grounds. There's a September 2012 report, a March 2014 report, and a January 2017 report, all prepared by competent engineers. Now, all the reports and my legal notices can be found on the park site if you want to read them. You can Google Caneel Resort National Park cleanup, and you will link to my notices and the reports that the engineering reports I referred to. Now let's get to the heart of what's in those reports. What did the environmental investigators find? I want to warn you ahead of time that I'll mention a number of chemicals that have really tough names. Many of them you've never heard. What you need to know is that they are all toxic, dangerous, and regulated by law. In the environmental reports you find on the web link, you can read about those chemicals. There's quite a list. Now, what did the 2012 report say? This is a quote: contaminants of concern include CERCLA, hazardous substances, pollutants, contaminants, petroleum products, and other controlled substances. There are 20 photos in the 2012 report that identify many areas of concern amounting to almost 8 acres of contamination. There were ripped bags of herbicides and pesticides spilled on the unpaved floor, on the ground. Unmarked and unlabeled 55-gallon drums were found in a wooden area. Now move forward to March of 2014. Based upon the first site assessment, they did a second one. They found asbestos pipes. They found mercury and arsenic that exceeded legal standards. They found organic chlorine pesticides, semi-volatile organic compounds found in a drainage ditch that drains in the beach on the west shore of Caneel Bay. Groundwater samples had strong petroleum odors. There were volatile organic compounds found in the water exceeding all legal levels. One example exceeded acceptable levels for organophosphorus, organochlorine pesticides, and metals like arsenic, selenium, and silver. One sample exceeded standards for benzofluoromethane. The wastewater treatment plant had indications of potential contamination and strong oil odors. And at the landfill site, 3 of 4 samples taken there exceeded levels for pesticide dieldrin, PCBs, which you've heard about, which are illegal, semi-volatile organic compounds, and a very dangerous metal called selenium. There were concerns that all these chemicals were leaching. That included alpha-chloridine, dieldrin, SVOCs, PCBs, selenium into the groundwater. And just like the labels on processed foods that you eat at the grocery store, sometimes you read them and see chemicals you've never heard of and you can't pronounce, but you know one thing, they're no good for you. Finally, after knowing about the substantial risks of environmental concern at Caneel for over 5 years, the Park Service finally did another study in 2017. That report said that groundwater had concentrations of benzene, a terrible chemical, dangerous chemical, ethylbenzene, naphthalene, 1 and 2 methylnaphthalene, and all of them exceeded the levels for tap water. The January 27 report concluded that the release of hazardous substances at Caneel poses a potential threat to the public health, welfare, and the environment. A removal action was necessary to address the migration of the contaminated soil, water, and the threat to public safety. Then what happened? Well, as you all know, Hurricanes Irma and Maria came in 2017 and almost destroyed everything at Caneel. Now ask yourself, if you would, where did all those toxic chemicals go? Oil and water don't mix. Were the chemicals spread further? Did they end up in the bay? Or in the sand, in the coral? Are the turtles affected? Were more chemicals, in fact, released because the places they were stored were destroyed? We really don't know. Are those questions being asked by the Park Service? Now, in December of 2020, I served a second or supplemental notice on all the parties that I served the first time regarding contamination of Caneel, because I learned from the Park Service that Mr. Gary Engel of CBI Acquisitions had refused to allow the Park Service onto the site to access the Caneel property to do additional environmental work, including drilling test wells to test the water. I also talked to people who told me that they knew that there was DDT that had been stored on the site in barrels. And in March of 2010, I have a report from the Park Service that there was a 1,000-gallon fuel spill with no evidence that that spill has ever to this day been fully cleaned up. I got a sample of asbestos that was removed from one of the buildings given to me by a former employee. A former employee reported that methyl bromide had been used for soil sterilization at Caneel. That's the same chemical that made all those people at Siranusa deadly sick. Is that chemical still there? And by the way, I want you to know the Park Service did respond to my 2 notices, but I served Mr. Engel and his company using a legal process server, and in spite of 2 legal notices, Mr. Engel and his companies have never responded in any way to me. Keep in mind that the first environmental assessment was in 2012, 9 years ago, and to my knowledge, no cleanup has occurred and no preventative measures have ever been put into practice to prevent more contamination. Who's responsible for this mess? Is it the Park Service that owns the land that never monitored the activities at Caneel and knew about the contamination and did nothing except request multiple assessments and reports? Is CBI Acquisitions responsible? Prior operators of the resort? Well, the law says that the owners of the property and any and all of the parties that are responsible for contamination can be held responsible for cleanup. Courts can order cleanup of the property and divvy up the costs of cleanup and even award attorney fees to somebody like me if I was successful in getting an order to clean up the mess. Now, after my 2 notices stating my intent to sue to force a cleanup, the Park Service, thankfully, 8 weeks ago, adopted a 300-page plan to further identify the nature and the extent of the contamination, and then present a response and alternatives regarding any cleanup of the contamination. I'm encouraged by the response from the Park Service and especially of our local superintendent, Nigel Fields. Now, we've been told by Superintendent Fields that we should expect to learn the results of the latest assessment in June of 2021. Engineers were on site in February. They collected samples as part of the assessment. I've not heard of any other timelines regarding how and when that contamination will be cleaned up, and I assume that we won't know the answer to that until the most recent assessment is completed. I would urge the Park Service to follow through on all of its plans to assess and remediate this contamination. A clean Caneel is in everyone's interest and would demonstrate a commitment to preserve and protect one of the most unique sites in the entire world. Remember that the Park Service mission is, the National Park is dedicated to conserving unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and the values of the National Park System for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. I believe that more voices included in this process adds integrity and will result in a better outcome for all of us. The Park Service had this listening session you heard about last week, led by Superintendent Fields, and that's a good and positive start. The National Park Service website you've heard also has instructions for including your voice. Make it heard. And wherever you are today, you took time to join us. And maybe you'd be interested in writing to the Park Service, Representative Plaskett, and our Governor Bryant. Make your voice heard for the lands and waters, please, that can't speak for themselves. Thank you.
Attorney DeGiacomo, thank you so much for helping us to better understand the environmental challenges at Caneel. I'll now pass the mic, so to speak, over to Mr. Clendenin of the Delegate's Office.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Representative Stacy Plaskett and her team, I want to thank Dr. Sewer and the St. John Heritage Collective, or St. JanCo, for inviting us to be a part of the Caneel Bay teach-in. I also want to thank WTJX, the other panelists in attendance, and the listening and viewing public for tuning in to this very important event. Before I get into my presentation on Caneel Bay, though, I would like to give the viewers a basic overview of what our office does. The Congresswoman likes us to, in any chance we get, to help educate the public on what it is we do, because many times we get phone calls and other inquiries that may seem like they are under our purview, but a lot of times, say for example, somebody calls, why won't they fix my road? So now technically, yes, we do work to get funding in DC for the territory, but an issue, once the money gets here to the territory, it is up to the local government as well as Public Works in that instance for them to be the ones to actually put the money to work and get it to fix those roads. So either way, currently the Congresswoman sits on several committees. She's in the Committee on Budget. She's in the Committee on Agriculture. And in agriculture, she sits as the chair of the subcommittee on biotechnology, horticulture, and research. She's also on the subcommittee on commodity exchanges, energy, and credit. She's on the subcommittee on livestock and foreign agriculture. She also sits on a very powerful committee, and it's a great accomplishment that she's the first member of the territory to sit on a committee on Ways and Means. In Ways and Means, she's also in a subcommittee on select revenue measures, as well as the subcommittee on oversight. So our Washington, D.C. office, they typically focus on legislation that not only affects the USVI, but also affects over 400 other congressional districts. To this end, we need to have the bandwidth to be able to handle not only policy that affects the USVI, but also the other 50 states and other territories. We participate in committee work and subcommittee work that creates legislative policies that are sent to the floor and House for final passage. Any of those policies that have advanced through the committee process and then are voted on favorably on the floor of both the House and Senate would typically become bills or amendments, and then of course they become public law. Our team in DC also has a communications and a press component, which we not only use for outreach and to spread our message to the masses, but also to get feedback from our constituents and other concerned citizens about major issues and challenges that they are facing daily. Our team has been hard at work over the last year dealing with remote meetings, TV and radio appearances, and also legislative hearings and sessions, which have now, of course, we have now been adjusted to conform with these new virtual meeting norms. Here in the district, my title is the district director. I am responsible for operations of our two offices. We have one located on King Street in Frederickstead on St. Croix. The other is here in the Porter-Sale Mall in Havenside on St. Thomas. Prior to the battery on St. John being destroyed, we also used to hold office hours over on St. John on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And so hopefully, once that building is restored, we may be able to resume those operations. Either way, these district offices act more as our customer service wing, as we spend a great deal of time working with our constituents and our residents. We are a great resource for individuals and groups who need assistance with federal issues. We do deal with a wide range of issues, such as veteran issues, Social Security, U.S. Postal Service issues, USDA and agriculture issues, infrastructure, education, immigration and passport issues, just to give you a short list of some of the things we work on. What we have experienced, though, in the wake of the two Category 5 hurricanes, and now with COVID-19, we have also been a resource that supports our local government agencies with sharing information or guidance on certain local issues. More recently, we've been helping with such issues such as housing, the Payroll Protection Program or the PPP, unemployment, stimulus funds, just to name a few. We also support the work of our staff in the DC office because we have to act as the eyes and ears for them so that they are aware of what's happening here at home, where our voters are, because the people of the VI are the ones that gave us this job to do on their behalf, so we can never forget that. For example, just last night, we had an event via Zoom. We had a virtual veterans town hall where we were able to listen to the concerns of our veterans, which, many of them, many employees of the park are veterans as well. But, we have veterans, and as many of you know, our territory sent quite a bit of people to war at a high rate per capita, and we have fought and lost our lives for this country, but we still do not get the same equal treatment like other veterans across the nation. So the town hall went well, and we will do our best to keep fighting for those veterans. Now, for Caneel Bay, who are the ones making the decisions? Well, currently the leaseholder, or the ones in control of the retained use estate, or the RUE, is CBI Acquisitions. They have the property rights until 2023, so they are the only entity at this time in discussions with the National Park Service. How active those discussions are and the timing of when decisions will be made is not clear to us because we are not part of those negotiations. The role of the National Park Service is to manage the national resources within the parks. Their main objective and mission is to preserve the conditions within those areas by limiting the impact of human and, in some cases, the natural impacts within these areas. From what I understand, even though the Park Service owns and manages the lands, they are allowed to get assistance from groups like Friends of the Park and other non-governmental organizations who can assist with those efforts. There are special cases where the operations of a park may be adjusted by an act of Congress, such as situations where personal injury could be an issue or other factors may create damage to ecosystem or human health. What we hope to accomplish as it pertains to Caneel future is, by participating in events like the listening session on Thursday night held by the National Park Service, and this forum we are holding today, spearheaded by Dr. Sewer. This teaching is part of that process. We have held our own town halls about the National Park Service, and we have continually encouraged the National Park Service to do the same. Just before the event, I was commenting to Dr. Sewer because the first time I met her was actually at an event back at, I think it was August of 2017. These events are critical to obtaining feedback from the stakeholders in the territory and those who have visited and enjoyed the park. This way, the National Park Service and Department of Interior can not only have statistical data, but also personal and anecdotal data that they can use in future planning. I must add that we do get quite a bit of inquiries, but not only Caneel Bay, but also about other national park matters like Buck Island over on St. Croix, Hassel Island, and other matters within the parklands and St. John. And we do encourage you to continue to send us those inquiries so that we are aware of those issues or observations. And so for anyone in the community, for anyone that wants to give us feedback on things that are working well within the parks, or more importantly, things that are not working, please contact our office. On St. Croix, you can call us at 340-778-5900. On St. Thomas, you can call us at 340-774-4408. And our Washington, D.C. office, that number is 202-225-1790. Or you can always visit our website, which is plaskett.house.gov. That's plaskett.house.gov. By contacting us through one of these methods, we'll ensure that your voice is heard. This is also helpful, even though we cannot promise that all inquiries will reach a favorable conclusion, but we cannot work to fix an issue if we don't know it exists. So please feel free to contact us, and we will do our best to assist you. So the Caneel Bay property, I feel in many ways is priceless. You can't place a real value on human experience or human enjoyment, for one, but you cannot place a value on the lives lost in 1733 during a rebellion, and additionally, the artifacts, the culture, and other items of historical value within the park. Then we also have the natural beauty of the beaches and the surrounding landscapes and other natural wonders. I did spend some time working at Caneel Bay with a contractor in the late 90s when they were doing renovations under Rosewood Resorts. So I did get to see the property in full swing. I was also able to meet many members of the staff, which were great people to work with at that time. And most of the other contractors on site were local businesses or business owners. This resort and its sister property, Cinnamon Bay, brought thousands of visitors annually to the territory. To support those visitors and also those doing staycations, Caneel Bay needed to engage with suppliers and purveyors here in the territory. Also, as with any large property that has its own infrastructure, Caneel Bay employed, whether on staff or on contract, mechanics, carpenters, welders, boat captains, the barges. I mean, I can go on and on with a long list of people and companies that also benefited from supporting the operation. So the result of a property like Caneel Bay being injected back into the USVI economy can be an enormous boon for our already fragile economy, as well as an added benefit to the people of the USVI. Also, depending on how it's built back, the resort can also benefit our young people and others through opportunities with the arts, employment, culinary arts, agriculture, and energy efficiency. So again, I'd really like to thank Dr. Sewer for inviting us here today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have at that appropriate time. Thank you again.
Mr. Clendenin, thank you so much for joining us and also for helping us all to improve our civic engagement by having a clearer understanding of the delegates' role. And I also do want to remind everyone who is listening in that you can post your questions in the chat, and we will go ahead and address those at the appropriate time. And now we are actually quite excited to hear from our park superintendent, Nigel Fields.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Sewer. Thank you very much. Thank you, JanCo, for this invitation to join this skill building broadcast. Thanks to WTJX for this platform, Friends of National Park, and also thank you to the Community Foundation of the Virgin Islands. And a very special thanks to my fellow panelists. I learned from each interaction that I have with each of you. I wanted to provide a little bit of background on my experience and the things that I bring to this subject. So I grew up in South Louisiana and South Mississippi. I was hunting in the pine savannas and fishing and crabbing in the Gulf marshes. It's how we spent a lot of our family time, and for a little while, it was also how we fed ourselves. When I was in my first professional job with the Louisiana Department of Health, I worked in the environmental department, and I was new and green. I was right out of school, and I was asked to shadow a more senior health official to a Superfund site at a community meeting. And as I was listening that evening to the audience speak, they had their 2 minutes at their microphone. I was noticing that what they were saying, some of them were describing how they personally hunted for years on this particular land in South Louisiana, or had fished in the stream that went through the property and led into an adjacent lake. And I was noticing the contrast between what they said versus the report that I had read the night before preparing to go to the meeting. It was a risk assessment report. But I noticed that what was in the report didn't seem to be the same realities of what people were describing. So with the support of that official that I was shadowing, I began conducting community interviews so that we can make sure that the state's health assessment reflected the realities of the people's lived experiences, that we were able to understand their real risks, and that we can determine the best ways to make sure we can protect them from further harm. I then moved on to the Environmental Protection Agency. I was there for 15 years in the Office of Research and Development, where I focused on at-risk populations and the science needed for environmental justice and innovations in molecular sciences to more rapidly translate science into protective actions for communities. In joining the Park Service, I found myself interacting with communities in sometimes unexpected ways. Citizens who were afforded no representation during the Jim Crow era and lost their riverside village in Chalmette, Louisiana, just outside of New Orleans, so that land could be donated to the National Park Service. Community elders whose parents and grandparents had accepted payment for their Cades Cove properties in Tennessee so that the family homesteads became a part of public lands, but felt that there was no one telling their stories of who they were and their significance to that incredible landscape there in Cades Cove. Time and time again, I found that the collective experience and wisdom and insights of community members was critically important for us to be able to better frame and understand what the problems were that we were facing. And more often than not, in my experience, the community is key to those solutions. For example, the community helped us at EPA find a way to stop the take-home pathway of toxic pesticides that were getting to children of farm workers in rural California and Washington State. By supplying real-world in-home data to officials in New York City, we were able to have integrated pest management being the first line of defense in public schools and public housing to protect children in New York City. The state of Oregon began using tribal science to shift their risk assessment models to protect tribal citizens, thereby better protecting all of the citizens of Oregon. Back in New Orleans, we work with some of the living former residents of Fazanville to better tell their story of condemnation of their homes and the removal of their church. We wanted people that got to Chalmette Battlefield to know that there was a village of free people of color and their descendants who lived on that landscape for almost 100 years before they were forced off by St. Bernard Parish. This year, fingers crossed, I'm hoping that the Smoky Mountains will be able to install the new Wayside exhibit in partnership with the Cades Cove Preservation Society that will indeed tell the story of those former settlers in a more universal and acceptable manner. So I'm providing these thumbnail examples, and I don't want to give the impression that all these things were easy, but the success that we experienced drew from combining the resources of our workforce with the knowledge that's inherent and the power that's inherent within communities. So although my presentation that I give today may be familiar to some of you, I'm thankful for this platform because it will likely reach some that I have not been able to interact with. And I hope that I can convey the importance of community input and community engagement now as we look at redevelopment, and also in June as the Park Service moves forward with advancing the next steps for cleaning up Caneel and the redevelopment. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. I'm not sure. Hopefully you can see. There we go. So I will continue here. So I want to start by framing what we're aiming to do in the context of the priorities of the Department of Interior under Secretary Deb Haaland. The Secretary's priorities for the Interior are for us to promote environmental innovation and clean energy, for us to bring forth a new generation of Americans to conserve and restore public lands and public waters, to make sure we're working closely with every level of government, state, local, as well as the private sector to promote conservation, and advancing environmental equity and environmental justice and engaging diverse stakeholders. And I think framing how we're aiming to, as Dr. Sewell was saying, reimagine some ideas around Caneel, it's helpful for us to think about what it would look like if we were to advance things like environmental innovation, clean energy. When we think about sustainability and renewable energy sources on site, efficiencies with potable water, thinking about Caneel Bay as a potential training ground for youth and career development, and clearly addressing some of the environmental equity issues is very timely right now. So I think this gives us a good frame for us to think about ways to engage on the future of Caneel. Some of this history has been discussed, but I think it's worthwhile just to make sure I can also repeat that, in short, the Caneel Bay Resort was established through donation to the Park Service from Jackson Hole Preserve in 1983. The donation was subject to the retained use estate, what we call the RU. And generally, this RU operates fairly independently from the National Park Service. The RU is set to expire September 30th, 2023, as Dr. Sewer mentioned. And at that point, the property converts back to, or converts over to, the National Park Service. Congress anticipated that this expiration date was coming up and passed Public Law 111-261. And the law is still relevant. It allows the Park Service to determine whether the best interest of the Park Service is to establish a long-term, non-competitive lease with the RUE holder. And currently that is CBIA. The law has stipulations, though. And one of the things it stipulates is that the new lease has to follow NPS leasing policies, such as maintaining the original footprint of the resort, keeping the general character of the resort, limiting the number of accommodations that can expand upon the site. So generally speaking, the law requires that the leaseholder protect and preserve the natural and cultural and historic features of the resort. Subsequently, after this law was passed, the Park Service launched an environmental assessment, and we did this under the National Environmental Protection Act. And back then, it also included the drafting of the historic district nomination to look at the historic sites on the site and to determine which ones are contributing to the overall district. That level 1 site assessment was done, and this is one of the things that Mr. DiGiacomo referenced, and it did reveal some concerns upon the site, which led to a level 2 site assessment that was done, and also the removal site evaluation report that also Mr. DiGiacomo referenced, where we determined that there were some clear concerns with the site and that they had to be addressed before negotiations could continue further. Clearly, Hurricanes Irma and Maria came forth and had their impact, and it's changed the conversation. We've now gone 11 years since this legislation was put forth for us to have the non-competitive lease. So we're not really starting from scratch. We have a lot that has been developed over the years, but as the negotiations continue forth with CBIA, I think it's critically important now, with the amount of redevelopment that has to happen, that the community now has input. And so one of my main messages, you heard this on Thursday for those of you who could participate, and my message today is now is the time to provide that input. We really want to hear, especially from St. Jonians and from Virgin Islanders, because of your lived experience here. We want to know what the future would look like to you, what you can imagine, what you'd like to see beyond just tourism and hospitality. I think Dr. Sewer's framing of some of the original concepts of tourism are helpful and they're instructive. And I think visioning forward would be helpful for us, the Park Service, to know how some of these domains are affected outside of tourism and hospitality, so that we can come up with the best solutions possible. Many complicated aspects of Caneel, but we certainly think that by bringing forth, once again, the benefits and the resources of our workforce and that of the community, we can find some shared success. Some of the things that we've heard so far in terms of environmental protection, economic development, ecological tourism, sustainability, environmental justice, historic preservation, all these things, I think it's time for us to make sure we're hearing from the community on what these things mean to you and how they could potentially inform our conversations with CBIA. Some of the things I heard from Thursday's listening session, which were really quite inspirational, were people's respect for not only the landscape and for some of the archaeological history, but also the underwater scenery that's there, that's pretty particular at Caneel. Folks mentioned some of the economic disparities between the visitors and the workers that they were concerned about. Thinking about interpretive programming at Caneel, what kinds of public programming can happen, ways to address the colonial realities of the past in the landscape, and finding ways to engage visitors in those histories. I think all those are really interesting and exciting insights, and we'd like to hear from you on those. So we're accepting comments from the public through May 7th, and you can see here on the screen how you can submit those comments. You can go to https://go.nps.gov/Caneel Bay, and you'll be directed to where you can input your comments. They will be read. I'll share those with our team. You can also send your comments through email or send them to us by snail mail. I want to just reference, and I know my time is running short here, that as an incoming superintendent, looking at some of the previous reports and what happened during the transition originally back in 2012 for the route to the lease, I noticed that we've received very little public comment. And in talking to folks here in my short time, getting to know the community, I see that people clearly have a lot of thoughts and engagements. And I know that those 1 or 2 comments that we received back then aren't reflective of all the thoughts and ideas you have now. So please, if you can, take the time to sit with a family member, a grandchild, nephew, brother, neighbor, godchild, whomever you'd like to sit with. If being in front of the computer isn't always comfortable for you, it's not the best way. I get it, I understand, but we would love to hear from you. If you can make sure that you can just in a few comments, a few statements, that'd be very helpful. Just a reminder that May 7th is the close of the public comment period. We will have a Virgin Islands open house on May 13th, and then we'll have a fuller discussion on the environmental work that's happening on June 10th. And thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent Fields. I actually really appreciated you taking the time to tell us a bit more about your personal trajectory, in part because I think it helps us to really understand the connections between our experiences here in the U.S. Virgin Islands and some of the wider experiences across the African diaspora in terms of relationships between Black and Indigenous people and the park systems. And also, you made a comment at the end about encouraging people to sit with their loved ones to help facilitate the process of giving feedback. And I think that that's such an incredible idea. And so I don't want that suggestion to get lost, in part because I think it would be very wonderful for those of us who may be more comfortable with the online submission process to actually go and take the time to have those face-to-face conversations with our loved ones and to relay their opinions because they do deeply matter and are critical for the decision-making process. And so thank you. I see that we do have some comments coming in the chat. And so we very much look forward to responding to those. But before we do so, we have our final remarks by Dr. Crystal Fort-Wrangler.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Hadia. Thanks to everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you to everyone who's already been mentioned, a long list, important list. And I would also like to add another thank you to every St. Johnian and Virgin Islander and resident who's attended Park Service public and private meetings for decades, trying to move the needle towards a better experience with Park Service. In the same way, thank you to the Park Service employees who have worked towards that as well. So much effort for so long. Unfortunately, as many know, much of that time, little has transpired. At times, yes, but on the whole, there's some to be desired. I think it's also important that these reminders to give comments to the Park Service and the Department of Interior are key, but it's important to still understand that the National Park Service is still going to make the decisions that they find to be best. So I think that part of this is also about considering ways to influence and shape that process that aren't only about submitting comments and participating in the Park Service's process. So there's a 65-year history of all of these interactions, and it's hard to cover that in 10 minutes. But we do need to keep in mind, I think, that this whole discussion about Caneel Bay and its future is situated in a long, difficult relationship, including a continued colonial one. But also, we have this great moment that the future of Caneel Bay can help to significantly reshape that history and move into better places. And I certainly appreciated Superintendent Fields' point, raising the priority at the Department of Interior in relation to conversations linked to environmental justice, and that we can certainly move forward perhaps in more productive ways at this point. So in my short time, I'll talk about why the decisions about the future of Caneel Bay must be considered in relation to what is called environmental justice, which you've heard mentioned. In the current moment we're in post-hurricanes, where we face what is called disaster capitalism, along with an increasing gentrification on the island of St. John. And hopefully discussing these concepts, and maybe in the following discussions, we can think about how they're linking those to Caneel Bay helps us establish that ancestral St. Johnians and Virgin Islanders should be at the heart of the future of Caneel Bay. I'll also discuss a section of the US Code and some federal environmental justice guidelines that we can be drawing upon to make the case to the National Park Service. And then we'll end, and Dr. Sewer may join in this or any point along the way. She knows as much about this as I do, certainly, that there's a long history of St. Johnians and Virgin Islanders advocacy around environmental injustices and how this can be a part of that continued space. So just quickly and really quickly, because there's not much time, but what is this environmental justice and disaster capitalism and gentrification that we might have a common language that we're talking about? So scholar Dorceta Taylor explains that environmental justice or injustice is something that's, quote, experienced through heightened exposure to pollution and the corresponding health risks, limited access to adequate environmental services, and loss of land and resource rights. And so these differences in exposure and access are linked to one's race, class, political status. So for example, a Black African-American community is sitting next to a toxic factory, experiences a heightened exposure, higher rates of cancer. And environmental racism is when groups are specifically targeted as locations for those sites. And there's evidence that that's been the case across the US in time and place. A limited access to environmental services, as an example, means that one doesn't have easy access to healthcare or healthy food options. It might also mean the loss of land or resource rights. For example, that the creation of a national park or a national monument might take away one's, say, historical fishing sites and rights to fish there, or the ability to collect natural resources for use in traditional practices. This certainly happened when the Virgin Islands National Park was created, in the same way many national parks limit what had been happening there previously. A more recent example of that is the creation of the Virgin Islands Coral Reef National Monument. We can also consider the advancement of Virgin Islanders in the park and positions of management as part of an environmental justice question, including at the top level of superintendent. I'll come back to that question about administration and management in Virgin Islanders towards the end. Another part of environmental justice is also to ensure that people have equal access to and can equally participate in shaping the policies that affect them. So for example, the US Environmental Protection Agency defines environmental justice, quote, as the equal treatment and involvement of all people in environmental decision-making, end quote. And that in itself, I think, has been particularly problematic at the Virgin Islands National Park, and why I hope that the decisions about Caneel and moving forward can help rectify some of that. We also have a conversation, Dr. Sue, I heard mentioned earlier, about environmental colonialism. And here's where we can take these conversations about environmental justice and link it into who has the power to tell the stories, who is shaping the narrative most directly with the public. And we should ask, has the Park Service done a great job of this? Has the Caneel site and those who have operated it, including Rockefeller, has Gary Engel? Is the main story about paradise and escape, or can we broaden that? Anyone following the conversations on VI social media right now can see that the situation on St. John with tourism is shifting towards being known as Key West. There's much more to be said about all of that. But where is the grounding for these kind of conversations to even think about what St. John is, and how can Caneel Bay play a part in that? Disaster capitalism, just quickly, is the way that private industries or philanthropies can spring up to directly profit from large-scale crises. And in the Virgin Islands post-storms, this situation is part of it. It's who's able to come in with new business investments, who can bring the capital, buy restaurants, buy land. Certainly that's been happening prior to storms, no question, but the storms have exacerbated that. And then gentrification is generally understood to be a process of neighborhood change. This is from the Urban Displacement Project, a process of neighborhood change that includes economic change in a historically disinvested neighborhood by means of real estate investment and new higher income residents moving in, as well as demographic change, not only in terms of income level, but also in terms of changes in the education level or racial makeup of residents. We see this happening on St. John by the second at this point, and more on St. Thomas and St. Croix as well. So what do all of those big concepts have to do with Caneel Bay? I've started to talk a bit about that, but let's think a little more detailed, and maybe in the conversation this can come up as well. Caneel Bay for the past century has been built around luxury ecotourism that has been owned and operated by elite and moneyed interests. While Rockefeller certainly had an interest in Virgin Islanders benefiting from the resort and park, that didn't always play out. Consider the issues that Dr. Sewer raised earlier. And it certainly isn't happening today in the ways that it could be. We must also keep in mind that the interests of Rockefeller and the National Park Service are focused on all citizens of the United States and global visitors. St. Johnians and Virgin Islanders are a part of that, but they're often been relegated to the side in park planning. One may argue that local populations should not have a priority in relationship to national parks, but in this case, I put forward to you that there are moral and ethical arguments to be made that they should. And also, one part of the US Code pertaining to the management of the park says they should be, and I'd really like to get to that and emphasize that in a moment. We can also consider federal environmental justice guidelines for the Department of Interior and why paying close attention to environmental justice is relevant here. We have a situation on St. John where there are increasingly fewer spaces that Virgin Islanders and St. Johnians feel comfortable. Survey any St. Johnian that you'd like. In a short documentary I helped make a few years ago, St. Johnian Kurt Marsh, Jr., also part of the St. JanCo, pointed out in the film that it feels like businesses on St. John are mainly catering to people who come in and who are transient, that St. Johnians have lost a comfortable space to just be, that some St. Johnians don't even want to come into town, they just stay home. That the narrative of Virgin Islanders has been eroded in these spaces. This is the gentrification and disaster capitalism we see especially at this moment. There are other reasons, no doubt, but these are major factors. And in this way, I think arguably Caneel Bay is one of the last opportunities for St. Johnians and Virgin Islanders to have a space, such a key location, to be able to shift the conversation about and experience of St. John, to create a place and the Park Service along with them where St. Johnians and Virgin Islanders feel as comfortable as the tourists and new residents do right now. So I have only a short time left. Let me get to the Title 16 in the US Code to put this out for consideration. So there was an amendment made to the code in 1978. It's Public Law 95-348 as part of the 95th Congress. It was an omnibus type act that authorized appropriations for certain insular areas of the United States and for other purposes. And within that bigger bill, so it was like Guam and US Virgin Islands, there's a clause that was added that reads, the Secretary, that's of the Interior, is authorized and directed to the maximum extent feasible to employ and train residents of the Virgin Islands to develop, maintain, and administer the Virgin Islands National Park. And that hasn't played out to the maximum extent possible to my best estimation. And this is an opportunity at Caneel Bay for that to take precedence. When they added this amendment in 1978, it was clear in the language throughout. Ron DeLugo, the delegate to Congress at the time, had long been advocating economic development assistance programs to assist small businessmen and help diversify the Virgin Islands economy. That was a part of the language, but it was also about the sensitivity of the plight of the people in the Virgin Islands. And so, it was all around this idea of better and more opportunities for people. And this seems to me to be the best opportunity right now. And I'll end with that the National Park Service is in a position, as is the Department of Interior right now, I think arguably, to help stop the full-on gentrification of St. John. And I don't see a way around the Park Service and the Department of Interior having to pay attention to the realities in which St. John is today and their role in getting to that place as well. So Hadiya, I'll pass it, Dr. Sewer, I'll pass it back over to you. Maybe if you wanted to mention a bit about the Virgin Islands and history of advocacy, that might be a good tie.
Yeah, and so one of the things I'll say really briefly is, of course, thank you, Dr. Fort Wrangler, for helping us to better understand environmental colonialism and disaster capitalism. I think that Caneel Bay in particular becomes is really one of the most glaring examples of our colonial relationship and its impact on the people of the Virgin Islands, but also the Virgin Islands environment. And so specifically, I think that one of the things that's really challenging for us as a community is essentially the fact that we do not necessarily have the decision-making authority or the power, so to speak, to make the final decisions as it relates to the Caneel Bay property. And so often we find ourselves having conversations, negotiating, so on and so forth. But having a non-voting representative in Congress, also not necessarily being able to vote for the President of the United States, and all of these impacts of our colonial relationship really illustrate at this one particular site why our marginal position under the US flag is truly problematic and plays out in so many different ways in our day-to-day lives. And I think that often when we talk about environmental injustice in the Virgin Islands, it's important to recognize to some extent that the Caneel Bay issue is not necessarily an isolated matter, so to speak. We have histories, of course, of being a military base. We also have an oil refinery on St. Croix. And so often we find ourselves having to navigate some of the complex, like economic, but also political forces that leave us grappling with colonial disempowerment, so to speak. So we have several questions here in the chat, and I'd like to, of course, thank each of the panelists for sharing like your knowledge and your expertise with us. And I'm actually going to combine some of the comments that we've received because I'm finding that there are some patterns and trends here. But specifically, we have a question from both Zara Rose and Leanne DiGiacomo about whether or not CBIA should be, or whether they are allowed to continue to have the RU at this or at a future date. And so in short, Leanne is asking whether or not there are consequences for CBIA for not following the RU, for restoring the property following the storms and not being good stewards of the property. And then you have Zara essentially asking, is it possible at all to limit their capacity to have the RU now or in the future? And so I'll pose that question to you all to start.
Well, I guess let me start. You know, as far as I understand it, like I said in my presentation, the RUE is currently between National Park Service and CBI. And, you know, so I guess the National Park Service will be evaluating whether or not they have or have not followed the conditions of the rule. And you know, and of course, we'll be watching and hoping, you know, that if they have violated it, that then they will have to deal with the consequences. But Attorney DiGiacomo, you know, you're the attorney. I'm not. What are your thoughts on this, sir?
Well, thank you. I pulled out the RUE document, and Mr. Rockefeller said specifically that anybody who held this RUE would have to, at all times prior to the termination of the RUE, use and maintain the premises in such a manner that will be consistent with the preservation of the outstanding scenic and other features and national significance, and preserve the premises to the extent feasible in their natural condition for the public benefit, enjoyment, and inspiration. There's some other language in there that I think says that it has to be returned to the Park Service in substantially the condition it was in when CBIA took it over. And of course, we've seen in the last more than 3 years that they've done nothing to meet the terms or conditions of that RUE. It's very unfortunate that the Department of Interior and its lawyers under prior administrations did not see fit to insist that Mr. Engel and his CBIA organization fulfilled its obligations under the RUE.
Yeah, and the only thing that I have to add to what was just mentioned by my fellow panelists here is that CBIA has expressed their interest, of course, in redeveloping, and they also have taken some of the steps to make some of the space accessible, like having the water sports activity around Honeymoon, and also reopening the restaurant there, Zozo's. So clearly, one of our top priorities is making sure we're moving forward with completing the environmental work, understanding what it's going to take for us to get the space cleaned up. And so at this point, we're still working with them step by step on those processes. And we'll have a much fuller discussion on that in June.
I'm actually going to slide in an additional question that we have from Giselia, essentially asking what impact or influence can our delegate have in the negotiations?
Yeah, so like I also said in my presentation, you know, we have been doing the public forums. We have, and thank you, Nigel, and your team, because you know, we've been asking to have you know, have the National Park Service reach out to the public to get their input. We have been doing the same, and we have been sending our concerns to the department. But again, we have basically been locked out of the discussions and negotiations. So, you know, we're right now on the sidelines, other than us, like I said, sending whatever correspondence we can, letting them know what the people of the VI want. We also encourage, because you know, we're on the House side, we also try to encourage the governor and his team and their lobbyists over on the Senate side to also you know, try to push the needle on that end, so that you know, it's a two-pronged approach to try to get something done as it relates to Caneel Bay.
Thank you. And so we actually have two questions about whether there might be subsequent listening sessions with the Virgin Islands National Park. And so Superintendent Fields, I'm hoping that you can clarify that for us.
Yes, so our main one that we just had was one of the ones that we'd like to, you know, kick off before going into the June session. So I'm hopeful that we'll have people to send in their comments. At this point, I don't have any other listening sessions scheduled between now and June, but it certainly was very refreshing to see how many people came out to the listening session that we had. But I also know that there were a whole bunch of people that didn't get a chance to participate for all sorts of reasons, technology reasons, time-wise, what have you. So I want to make sure that people do get in their comments to us. But our next scheduled public meeting outside of the May 13th virtual open house, that's going to focus on broader National Park Service issues in the Caribbean, St. Croix, St. John. The next main one focused on Caneel will be the one on June 10th, and that's going to be primarily focused on the environmental work.
We have, thank you, just enough time for perhaps a 60-second rapid response to this question by Rada Spare. And I actually want to put this here because I think it's a really great question, and as it relates to reimagining Caneel. And essentially, given the limiting description of what is allowed on the Caneel property, specifically the language of a same footprint or similar use, to what extent are we able to reimagine Caneel beyond the non-luxury resort operation that currently exists?
Yes, it's a great question. So just looking at, once again, the legislation from Public Law 111-261, there were some limitations in that law. So for us to move forward with the non-competitive lease, it is likely that we'll have to keep things fairly similar based upon the law as how they were, and limit the term of the lease to 40 years, as the legislation calls for. Clearly, if we had a competitive process, which anybody could then, including CBIA, anyone could submit to. That offers some other options. We'd be able to go up to 60 years. But at this point, I'm not sure how much flexibility we have. I'm not the attorney, but I do think that the law does demonstrate that there's some limitation in terms of the overall footprint. Now, clearly some of the buildings have to be rebuilt. So even if you keep the same footprint, there may be some flexibilities with building in the same footprint, more or less, keeping the same number of rooms. I think what we did at Cinnamon Bay, for instance, at Cinnamon, we had to make some adjustments to keeping the same footprint, but build up. Because of archaeological resources that we need to protect at Cinnamon Bay. So as we go through the redevelopment there, the number of rooms are the same for the most part. We ought to able to make some upgrades, but also build up a bit to protect the resources. So the footprint is the same, the number of rooms is the same, but it actually looks different and to be modernized. So there are some ways to make sure that we can increase modernization, being within the same footprint, keeping the same number of rooms. But when you have such a major redevelopment that has to happen, we won't be able to keep everything that's there. Not everything is in good working condition. So there will have to be some changes to the site.
Thank you so much for clarifying that for us. It actually appears that we are at the end of our teach-in. This time actually flew by quite quickly. And so, of course, I would like to thank all of the panelists for taking the time to join us and for helping us to better understand what's happening at Caneel Bay, but also really giving us some of the language and tools that are necessary for continuing and developing our own advocacy around the future direction of Caneel. We know that it is a very critical property for our economy, but also it holds a lot of value in terms of the historical and cultural and environmental resources that are there. And so for many of us, we would really love to see Caneel Bay land in good hands or safe hands, so to speak. With that being said, I would like to thank again everyone who made this teach-in possible. And specifically, I'd like to thank the team at WTJX and also Tonya Lovejoy and the Friends of the Virgin Islands National Park, as well as all of the support that we received by way of the Community Foundation of the Virgin Islands. We certainly hope that this is not the last time that we will hear from our fellow Virgin Islanders as it relates to the Caneel issue. We thank you for your comments in the chat and also for your continued engagement at town halls, at doorsteps and living rooms, community meetings. A lot of the advocacy that's taken place has truly been driven by you. So thank you and take care.
Thank you.